Can we go ahead and get started then, Carl?
Give me 1 minute, please.
Okay. David Diaz, Professor Diaz from the University of Costa Rica will get us started here.
In 10 seconds.
Buenas tardes a quienes nos acompañan en América. Buenas noches a quienes nos siguen desde Europa y otros lugares. Mi nombre es David Díaz Arias. Es un gusto para mí dar inicio a esta mesa redonda sobre políticas de cristiandad en América Latina. Y voy a compartir este espacio de moderación con mi colega, el doctor Kevin Coleman de the University of Toronto. Este espacio surgió como parte de un esfuerzo que hemos hecho el doctor Coleman y yo para hacer un curso global, una clase global que se está impartiendo desde enero, tanto en la Universidad de Costa Rica como en the University of Toronto, y que cuenta con 20 estudiantes matriculados en Toronto y 30 estudiantes matriculados en la Universidad de Costa Rica. En esta clase hemos estado discutiendo con respecto a diferentes momentos y hechos de la cristiandad en América Latina durante un largo periodo que comienza en 1930 hasta la actualidad. Y por eso hemos invitado a 3 destacados colegas que van a participar en esta mesa. Le doy el pase a mi colega Kevin Coleman.
Awesome. Thanks, David. I'd like to introduce our 3 guests. We're really grateful to each of you for taking the time on a Saturday to be with us. Professor Benjamin Cowan he did his bachelor's degree at Harvard University and his PhD at UCLA. He's now a full professor at the University of California, San Diego, and the author of 2 incredible books. The first one, Securing Sex, Morality and Repression in the Making of Cold War Brazil, won a number of prizes, including the prestigious Brazil Section Award from the Latin American Studies Association. His second book, Moral Majorities Across the Americas, is one of these insanely prescient works that seems to have written a history foretold. It helps us understand what we're living through right now in the United States, in Brazil, in El Salvador, oddly enough. Actually, El Salvador may be innovating on what Brazil and the US have done. But for that, we'll have maybe a few words from Matthew Cohen. Anyhow, we're deeply grateful to you, Ben, for joining us. Matthew Cohen is, let me see if my slides will advance. Oh, it's a little out of order. Well, no, let me introduce Hema Clope Santa Maria second. Professor Clope Santa Maria is a historian and a sociologist who specializes in violence, crime, religion, and gender in 20th and 21st century Latin America. She focuses mainly on Mexico and Central America. She's an assistant professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University in DC. In 2021-22, she was a junior fellow at the Freeburg Institute of Advanced Studies. And prior to joining GWU, she was an assistant professor at the Loyola University in Chicago and the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. She's held a number of prestigious fellowships, including at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at Notre Dame And she has a PhD in sociology and historical studies from the New School for Social Research. Her work here on the screen, In the Vortex of Violence, Lynching, Extralegal Justice, and the State in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, is this brilliant study that of popular Catholicism, official church teaching, and the way these get reworked in after the Cristero War. That's the bit we're reading. Actually, we read an article of yours, Hema, for class that actually wasn't from your book. So I'm speaking more now of the article that we enjoyed. Anyway, we're deeply grateful to you for joining us today. And then let's introduce Matthew Wellen. He's an assistant professor of moral theology in the honors program at Baylor University, where his teaching and research centers on Catholic social thought, Latin American and liberation theologies, and ecological theology and ethics. He's written this award-winning book. It's one of, I did not expect to find a work of theology to be the sort of the most moving thing I've read in many years, but this is quite a work. It has a radical argument about Catholic social teaching, the commons, land, and of course Oscar Romero. He's working on 2 additional projects, Christianity and Agroecology, under contract with Cambridge University Press, and another called Poverty, Luxury, and Art with Natalie Carnes. And that book asks how Christians faithfully negotiate the excesses of art in a world in need. Matthew, thank you so much for being with us today. So I think with that, we'll get us started. David, perhaps I could ask the first question and you could ask the second one. Would that be okay? Yeah? Okay, I have to stop sharing my screen. There we are. Okay, great. Or David, you can ask the first question. Would you like to ask the first question?
Sí, está bien. Bueno, muchas gracias nuevamente, Gema, por estar en esta mesa redonda. Gema, en nuestro curso han leído algunos de tus trabajos y alguno de ellos has examinado cómo algunas creencias católicas, como la noción.
David.
Sí.
Sorry about that. I may have mixed you up, but we're going to start with a sort of a broad question for all 3 of them. Maybe I'll ask that. You ask Hema the question when we get to that point. Okay. Sorry about that, folks. We're getting our itinerary out of order. We're like Southwest Airlines here. But so we wanted to ask you guys. Each of you is just remarkably productive as a scholar. Could you tell us, you've each written from very different perspectives, different disciplinary traditions, and Matthew, we wanted you here as a theologian. Don't feel that we've ambushed you, we have not. But also you historians, we want you to speak critically as you have based on your empirical work. But each of you has authored important studies on the history, politics, and theology of Christianity in 20th century Latin America. So could you tell us what brought you to your topic of inquiry? And we can go in any order. Maybe in the order I introduced you, Ben, Hema, and Matthew.
Sure. Thank you all so much for being here. First of all, to my co-panelists here whose work I so deeply appreciate and respect, and then also to David and Kevin for organizing all of this, and to everyone who's listening. I can't see all of your faces, but I'm just so grateful that you are interested in these ideas. My own interests came out of, I think all of us have a little bit of a sort of a personal stake in what we study, and that is certainly true for me. I, just wanted to know, really sort of for both of these projects, kind of how did we get here? I I think my first book, which was about the role of morality in generating certain kinds of anti-communist repression in Brazil and elsewhere, came out of my desire to think about like how morality and gender and sexuality in particular, and ideas about them and reactions to them sort of inform the construction of radical difference and the ability to engage in authoritarianism or atrocity. And then sort of building off of that for the second project, I really started to think, now, wait a minute, how did we get to the crossroads that we're at? Because, you know, the second book, I really wanted to look at how we got the sort of configuration of right-wing authoritarianism that we have in, as Kevin pointed out, so many of the places where all of us live and work now. And with that book, I sort of had the, I don't know, fortunate or unfortunate experience, depending on how you look at it, of asking questions that seemed kind of silly at the time and that became more and more serious. You know, I can remember giving talks about Jair Bolsonaro, who was once a federal deputy in Brazil, and, you know, quoting some of the things that he was saying and, you know, chuckling to myself and getting chuckles from the people that I was talking to. And those chuckles sort of slowly diminished over time, right up until the present day. So for me, the question was, how did we sort of arrive at the place that we are, whether that be the presidency of a Bolsonaro or the sort of way that we talk about culture war and divisions based on faith and politics, and where the sense of those divisions as identitarian as opposed to policy-based came from. And so, you know, I guess in one sense you could say I just have like a personally unhealthy fascination with right-wing actors in politics, but that's certainly what led me to both of my projects was, you know, really a personal as well as a scholarly desire to tell the story of our present.
Thank you. That's great. Let's, Hema.
Sure. Thank you. And I also want to echo my appreciation for the invitation by Kevin and David and David. And it is really a privilege to be in conversation with Matthew and Ben. And so thank you very much for this opportunity. And I guess my encounter with the topic of religion and Christianity was a little bit of an accident, if you will. And I'm glad that you show the picture of my book, because that's how I came about to this topic. So I was interested mostly in understanding the relationship between violence and state formation in Mexico, in 20th century Mexico, paying particular attention to the post-revolutionary period that is supposed to be, well, that it is these are very formative decades for the process of modernization and centralization of the Mexican state, and traditionally have been understood as a period of relative pacification and you know, where the political institutions gain greater stability. And so against that, I began to see all these cases of lynching, these like collective, extra-legal, and particularly cruel form of violence. And I analyzed in that book over 360 cases in detail that took place over these 3 decades, from 1930 up to 1960. And then, you know, several of these cases, and I should also say, also like Ben, like my interest on lynching was a history of the present. No, I mean, as many of you might know, lynching continues to happen in several countries in Latin America, in Mexico, Guatemala, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, but also less known cases such as Argentina. And so several of the cases that I examined were actually perpetrated by people that identify as Catholics, and they were, you know, covertly or overtly perpetrated or approved or counted with approval of the clergy, especially parish priests. So I began to be increasingly interested on this, you know, relationship between religion and violence. So this book project that I'm working on right now looks at the relationship between religion and violence in 20th century Mexico, with particular attention to the period that takes place after the end of the Cristero War. So, you know, like this, the religious conflict par excellence that took place in Mexico from 1926 and 1929, and trying to understand like this relationship as a very contentious relationship, no? And I would say that what is fascinating to me is that, you know, you would think that given the fact that Mexico is the the second country with most Catholics in the world, not just after Brazil, like in terms of sheer numbers of people that identify as Catholic. And given that Mexico is also considered one of the most violent countries in Latin America today, based on levels of homicide, you would think that this relationship has been explored, but actually hasn't. I mean, certainly not from a historical viewpoint and in a systematic manner, and especially paying attention to what happened after the 1930s and after this alleged détente between state and church in Mexico. So I would say that this is what inspires my work, is trying to understand this complex relation, and I can say a little bit more of why I think it's not so easy to understand it, but this is what is driving my research and how I came to religion, and how I am also increasingly being pushed to complicate this relationship and to understand also Christianity's relation to traditions of peace building, which it's another aspect of my research that I hadn't had the chance to explore before.
Thank you, Hema. It's awesome. Yeah. Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin and David, for organizing this and for inviting me. I feel something of an interloper because, as you mentioned, I'm a theologian, but I love reading about Latin American history, and I admire the work of my co-panelists, and so I'm really happy to be a part of this conversation. My book, I guess, and a lot of my research has pretty deep roots biographically. I guess some of the most proximate roots are after college, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras, and I was working on a farming project with farmers that grew basic grains, maize, frijoles, and coffee for cash income. And I think that at that time, I mean, a lot of our work was focused on helping those farmers survive on the hillsides of Honduras. And the question, when you looked out at the valleys below of, vast fields of sugarcane, was why are farmers farming this land and not that land down there? That land would be much better for food production. This land that we're on, these hillsides, they erode. Where so much of our work is about sort of conserving the soil on the hillside, right? And so that just started a series of questions, I guess, for me about why is it that the marginal people of this society live on this marginal land? Why can't they live on better land? Have there been efforts in the past to think through these questions? And, I didn't know much about the history of land reform in Latin America at the time. And so I just got interested in that. And I found it was during that time that I went to El Salvador. I knew about Romero, but I didn't know about his or the Catholic Church's deep involvement in those struggles in El Salvador. And I didn't know how important they were for understanding the conflicts that led to his death. So that was really the beginning of my interest in that topic. And when it became time to write a dissertation in my graduate work, that's what I decided to write on. So that's how it came about.
Thank you, Matthew. I should say I forgot. I introduced the training that Ben and Hema received. I should say that Matthew did his PhD at Duke University. Thank you to all three of you. David.
Gracias. Volvemos entonces con la aerolínea que despegó antes. Nuevamente, gracias, Gema, por tu participación. Decía que hemos leído algunos de tus textos en este curso y hemos visto que has examinado cómo algunas creencias católicas, como las nociones de martirio, sacrificio y violencia redentora, han sido utilizadas para legitimar la violencia, particularmente los linchamientos en México durante la década de 1930. ¿Podrías, Gema, describir esta relación entre la fe cristiana y el ejercicio de la violencia en el contexto de la década de 1920 y 1930 en México?
Sí, con mucho gusto. And I should continue in English, right? Is that
Como
right?
quieras, si puedes hablar en español.
Ok, bueno, entonces sí, puedo cambiar. Sí, como decía, pues mi interés nace a partir de este estudio de estas formas de violencia colectiva y justamente me doy cuenta que muchos de estos actos son perpetrados en nombre de la religión, en nombre de Cristo, ¿no? Y lo interesante, digamos, de la trayectoria de México es que la cristera ha sido estudiada por muchísimos, hay muchos trabajos, ¿no? Y es uno de los campos, digamos, más ricos en la historiografía de México. Pero lo que sucede después de los 30 es mucho menos conocido, ¿no? Y ya cuando nos adentramos en los 40, 50 es aún menos estudiado. Y lo que a mí me parece fascinante de este periodo en particular es que en 1929 hay un acuerdo entre la Iglesia y el Estado, ¿no? Y un proceso dentro del cual ambas partes, o sea, el Estado por revolucionario promete poner un alto a sus medidas anticlericales e iconoclastas, y la Iglesia Católica, por su lado, al menos la jerarquía, también promete que va a dejar de darle apoyo a estos militantes que apoyan el uso de violencia y la toma de las armas. Sin embargo, lo que vemos es que ninguna de las partes realmente cumplen, y a mí lo que me interesa es ver cómo más bien el Estado no cumple, pues porque continúa como con muchos ataques a la religión y sobre todo a la religión católica. Digamos que los protestantes tienen un trato, si no preferencial, al menos no tan agresivo por parte del Estado mexicano, porque los protestantes son vistos como una religión que es afín a la política de secularización, modernización y digamos como racionalidad que el Estado está promoviendo. Pero lo interesante es que a pesar de que la Iglesia Católica efectivamente, digamos, como da la jerarquía, ¿no? O sea, desde el Vaticano, pero también el Arzobispo de México y a nivel local se da como la orden de que se detenga este uso de la violencia, en la práctica lo que tienes es que los católicos de a pie continúan apoyando el uso de la violencia y continúan pensando que esta no nada más es necesaria, sino que es que se justifica moralmente hablando, ¿no? O sea, y entonces hay una fascinante reapropiación de los significados del martirio, donde el mártir no es necesariamente aquel que muere en nombre de Cristo por defender la religión, sino que es también aquel que mata en nombre de Cristo, ¿no? Y entonces esta noción de martirio, desde luego, está muy influida también por construcciones de masculinidad, ¿no? O sea, de valentía, de virilidad, y también hay una cierta feminización de aquellos católicos que no se atreven a tomar las armas, ¿no? Entonces, a mí me interesaba me interesa en mi trabajo, por un lado, entender la historia de la violencia religiosa más allá de esta mirada macro de las relaciones iglesia y Estado, que ha por mucho dominado la historiografía. Me interesa más entender cómo los católicos de a pie entienden la religión y la necesidad o la legitimidad de la violencia para defender la religión. Y por otro lado, sí, también mostrar que los católicos también estaban profundamente divididos, ¿no? O sea, no nada más entre el clero y las organizaciones como seculares, sino también entre el clero mismo. O sea, hay sacerdotes que están apoyando el linchamiento de maestros socialistas, hay otros que lo están criticando muy fuertemente, y esa división se observa también entre los católicos de a pie, ¿no? Entonces, creo que digamos, complicar un entendimiento que existía entre contemporáneos revolucionarios de que todos los católicos eran fanáticos religiosos que obedecían de manera ciega lo que el clero decía. Evidentemente la historia es mucho más complicada, ¿no? Y finalmente lo otro que me gustaría mencionar es que una cuestión que a mí me interesa mucho también es complicar esta noción de que la violencia del Estado secular era o es una violencia modernizadora que tiene como fin o como resultado la construcción de paz, o sea, nada más lejos que la realidad, ¿no? Entonces me interesa también como complicar esta construcción binaria donde se ve la violencia religiosa como una violencia que refleja la ignorancia y el fanatismo de la gente, y por otro lado, supuestamente la violencia del Estado como una violencia modernizadora y que construye paz, ¿no? Y entonces mi trabajo trata también de dar cuenta de eso y bueno, y sigo trabajando en eso porque, como decía, esta es parte de un nuevo proyecto de el libro. Entonces ahora estoy como viendo décadas después de los 30, 40, 50 y moviéndome así en lo que queda del siglo.
Bueno, y es un maravilloso trabajo el que has hecho, probando esta heterogeneidad de posiciones frente a algo que parecía prácticamente monótono. Gemma, por curiosidad, más temprano decías que como historiadora vas al pasado, pero con un ojo en el presente. Y quería preguntar entonces si notas rasgos de esto que vivió México hace 100 años, esa violencia desencadenada por las reformas liberales y enfrentando el catolicismo. Si notas rasgos de eso en el México actual, que tiene una violencia similar, pero motivada en principio por el enfrentamiento entre carteles y militares.
Sí, muchas gracias por esa pregunta porque sí, efectivamente, mucho de mi trabajo como historiadora está motivado por entender lo que sucede hoy en día en México y otros países de América Latina. Y yo diría que, por un lado, hay una manifestación de esta violencia religiosa que es muy similar a la que yo observo a mediados del siglo XX y que se da como en distintas décadas, y es violencia antiprotestante, ¿no? O sea, expulsiones y linchamientos y amenazas perpetrados por católicos contra protestantes tienen una importancia muy clara en varios estados de México, sobre todo en Oaxaca y en Chiapas, en estados del sur de México. Continúa una violencia de carácter sectario, pero que tiene, donde veo muy claramente, como antes también, la relación entre creencias religiosas, pero también conflictos intracomunitarios de larga data, conflictos de acceso a recursos y también competencia electoral y competencia política, ¿no? Entonces, a mí también me gusta siempre decir que la manera en la que yo me aproximo a la religión no es una manera purista, y creo que nadie lo puede hacer, porque una vez que se entiende la religión como algo vivido, es imposible no dar cuenta de los distintos registros en los que se vive la experiencia religiosa, ¿no? O sea, en términos políticos y en términos, digamos, de cuestiones que tienen que ver con intereses más materiales o de acceso a recursos. Entonces, esa es quizás como la más clara continuidad donde poco ha cambiado, aunque claro que siempre los actores justifican sus acciones de acuerdo a los tiempos, pero hay una línea muy clara de una larga historia de violencia antiprotestante en México que continúa hasta el día de hoy. La otra, digamos, el otro registro que no es como tan clara la relación es lo que mencionabas, David, sobre la violencia vinculada a la guerra contra las drogas, ¿no? Y aquí, digamos, por un lado quisiera mencionar que sabemos, ¿no?, que ha habido decenas de sacerdotes que han sido asesinados en el marco de la guerra contra las drogas, ya sea por grupos criminales o con el apoyo y la complicidad de autoridades locales. Estos han sido asesinatos extrajudiciales que en muchos casos tienen las señas de homicidios cometidos por el crimen organizado, o sea, donde hay como actos de tortura de por medio o donde los cuerpos se dejan en la vía pública. Y yo diría que tanto en el pasado como en el presente, la relación entre religión y violencia es ambivalente, ¿no? O sea, como tomando las palabras de Scott Appleby, por un lado, tenemos sacerdotes en México que claramente se han arriesgado porque se han pronunciado en contra de la guerra contra las drogas, algo que afecta no solamente a los grupos de crimen organizado, sino también a aquellos agentes del Estado que están a favor de que continúen estas políticas punitivas o que se benefician del negocio de las drogas. Por otro lado, sabemos también por el trabajo de periodistas de investigación que hay sacerdotes que han aceptado dinero y fondos de estas organizaciones criminales a nivel local, ¿no? Lo que se conoce como narcolimosnas o narcocapillas. Entonces, es una relación compleja, ¿no? Y sabemos también que hay intervenciones muy valiosas, o sea, por parte de personas, individuos que se identifican como religiosos o que pertenecen a órdenes religiosas, sobre todo los jesuitas, han hecho una labor impresionante de construcción de paz, ¿no? Entonces creo que quizás como la observación que se sostiene tanto en el pasado como en el presente es que esa relación entre religión y violencia no es causal, no es lineal, es cambiante, es ambivalente y siempre hay que entenderla como en el terreno.
Muchísimas gracias, Gemma, por esas respuestas. Kevin, do you want to ask Matthew?
Sure. Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Emma. Matthew, so in your book, you argue that Romero's support for agricultural reform was guided by what you call a theological grammar of creation as a common gift. What does land reform have to do with a belief in God as creator? And how was this belief instantiated in Oscar Romero's ministry? And finally, I guess, what did this belief have to do with his death?
Yeah, that's a very good and big question. And it's, at the heart of the book I wrote about him. I guess the short answer is for the modern Catholic social teaching tradition, which dates from the late 19th century and is widely seen to begin with Leo XIII's encyclical or letter Rerum Novarum. The idea that creation is a common gift is pretty clearly articulated. And one of the things I'm trying to show in the book is that for the modern Catholic social teaching tradition, land reform has a lot to do with that belief in God as a creator. That's the basic bedrock out of which the teaching on land reform grows. So my work really focuses on the social teaching tradition, which develops over the course of the 20th century, and it develops by way of clarification of principles and the application of the teaching to new and changing circumstances. And so one of the things I'm looking at is the way that it's really after the post-war period that the teaching, the thought, that the belief that has really deep roots in Christianity, that creation is a gift given by God for common use, not for sort of exclusive private appropriation or hoarding, but rather that what creation most fundamentally is a gift given for common use. That belief after the Second World War especially begins to get applied in terms of land reform. So you get popes and the teaching tradition talking about land reform being necessary to address the vast inequalities in wealth, as well as the growing concentration in land and distribution and access. So as I mentioned, that root, it's a belief that has deep roots within Christianity. Like one of the earliest Christian texts we have, the Didache, which basically means teaching, talks about, for instance, it has this line at one point: if you are sharers, of course, addressing Christians, in what is imperishable, how much more so are you sharers in the things that perish? And the basic sort of structure of that way of thinking is that heaven and life with God is a reality that is fundamentally common. That is, heaven is a place where people hold God in common. And therefore, in anticipation of that heavenly life, we on earth, committed to this belief about God, should be sharers in all things. And so anyway, so my argument, right, in the book is that Romero, like many others in the church, were inheriting and trying to apply this teaching about creation. And specifically the way that teaching got applied in the Catholic social teaching tradition in relationship to land reform. And they met a pretty hostile opposition to it. And if you haven't read Dr. Cowan's work on Brazil and one of the main sort of currency traces throughout is a group called Tradition Family Property that emerges in Brazil. And I'm very interested in the linkages between this group and some of the at least ideological currents that were happening in El Salvador around Romero's time. I I haven't found sort of explicit sort of evidence that there was contact among his opponents and this group, but certainly they were saying very similar sorts of things. So they met, Romero and many others within the church, a very sort of hostile opposition and resistance to what they were trying to do. And of course, for someone like Romero and many others, not all of those who were trying to sort of apply this teaching on land reform, they thought of themselves as just trying to be faithful Catholics, applying the traditional teaching that they had inherited. And they were up against all these people that also thought that they were traditionalist Catholics in a way, sort of resisting the teaching in the name of tradition, right? And so what you have is this really complex conflict internal to the Catholic Church about what it means to be a Catholic, about orthodoxy, about the tradition. Because again, both of these groups thought of themselves in many ways as sort of inheritors of that tradition. So what does this have to do with Romero's death? Well, I mean, it has a lot to do with Romero's death, because something that just wasn't particularly evident in the scholarship on Romero, at least that I was reading, was the fact that these debates about land reform in El Salvador really came to head in the late 70s and really at the beginning of 1980. So a government came to power. There was a sort of a major overthrow, coup of the Salvadoran, sort of the military Salvadoran regime in 1979. And this junta came to power. And one of the main things that they were arguing for was land reform, right? They thought that this was crucial to sort of stave off civil war. And from late 79 to early 1980, there were debates about land reform, and then it was beginning to be implemented in El Salvador. And Romero was very involved, like many others. Ignacio Ellacuría, many of the Jesuits at the University of Central America, La UCA, they were deeply involved in these debates, and they were helping guide the process in complex ways. And so in March 1980, when the land reform began to be implemented, it came with an incredible amount of violence. The story of the land reform and the rollout of the land reform is really, really complex. It was accompanied by a lot of repression. The Salvadoran military was part of the implementation of it. And really, this is sort of the descent of El Salvador into civil war. And it's no coincidence that during the same time as Romero in his homilies was advocating for land reform, he was soon to be killed. And some of the major architects of his death, Roberto Dabuizen and others, they were also deeply involved in these sort of anti-land reform efforts. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you very much. David, would you like to ask Ben the next question?
Yeah, sure. Ben, thank you for being in this roundtable again. You have written two amazing books about the way religion play very important roles in contemporary and historical societies in Latin America, in the Americas as a whole. In your most recent book, Ben, you shared the symbiotic relationship between right-wing Catholics and Protestant evangelicals in Brazil and the United States. Some of us will be surprised to learn that Brazilian religious conservatives play such an important role in shaping the authoritarian political movements that have rocked these two countries in recent years. Could you, Ben, give us an overview of how this worked? Who were the main actors that you study and the central events?
Thank you, as like my co-panelist said, thank you so much for these really insightful questions. I just find it really personally useful to think about these in concert with you all, and especially with Matthew and Gemma. Especially when as we just heard from Matthew about, some sort of theological concerns, and especially this, notion of common use and of an idea of a sort of a gift and of certain forms of theological and then material generosity circulating in 20th century Christianity. I think sort of as a counterpoint to that, I really wanted to know how we arrived at a Christianity that would completely execrate those ideas, right? That, would reject the notion of common use in any form, right? From land to, so-called public goods to redistribution or egalitarianism in general. And one of the things that I found as I sort of engaged in that question about, religious conservatism, both Catholic and Protestant, was a story of, I would call it like convergence as well as coincidence and cooperation, right? A sort of a story that involves both like intention on the part of Catholics and Protestants to come together around certain issues, but then also, people in different places and in different faith traditions sort of arriving at ideas, simultaneously, and then sharing those ideas in various ways, but sometimes kind of like just kind of in a way, to use the common parlance, for a sort of like game recognized game effect, right? Like seeing commonalities across both doctrinal and national differences, and, sometimes being a little like surprised at the ability to identify each other and to work together, or to not even have to work together because they'd already arrived at the same sort of positionality. So the general arc of that, to put it in the simplest terms possible, I think, would be a kind of a movement from, early 20th century or even late 19th century Catholic and Protestant reactions within denominations to doctrinal modernism, right? To innovations in the theology. And you certainly see at the end of the 19th century and in the early decades of the 20th century in both faith traditions and within them, right? A sort of reaction against innovations of all kinds, right? Liturgical innovations as well as theological interpretations, especially the notion of asking critical questions about the nature of God's love and of what that means about heaven and hell and sin and punishment, and particularly like inclusion and exclusion, both ethereally and as well as on earth. And from that place of a sort of like growing denominational tensions, you get in the mid 20th century a fusion of that kind of reaction to doctrinal modernism with anti-communism, right? And this happens in both Protestant and Catholic circles, where the sort of latent material of anti-communism that has, really exploded out of the papal encyclical that Rerum Novarum that Matthew mentioned, and then also the sort of the deep anxieties about doctrinal and liturgical innovations, right? Those two things, anti-communism and doctrinal anti-modernism, really fuse with each other in several faith traditions and are a kind of an explosive mix, right? That means that both traditionalist Catholics and anti-modernist Protestants find themselves fighting battles that they can see are the same, right? And that happens, part of the story that I try to tell in the book is, how, both extremely conservative Catholics in Brazil and also extremely conservative Protestants in Brazil start to, preach and react to the same things. And then how that story transnationalizes, right? How they can see not only across these, extremely deep, right, and extremely important denominational barriers, right? I mean, this is something that kind of blew my mind, right? Is these people who are, at the same time that they're denouncing their counterparts in other faiths, right? Very conservative Protestants in no way see eye to eye with Catholics on anything theologically, and very conservative Catholics think of, Protestants as the apotheosis of a satanic process that began with the Reformation, right? These are people who have every reason to sort of hate each other in philosophical terms, but they start to see, well, actually, we care about the same things in a sort of developing cultural and political war that begins to involve the faith in really important ways. So the main actors that I focus on are some, key bishops that had not really been studied in depth in Brazil. And those include Geraldo Proença Sigol and Antonio de Castro Mayer, who are, names that were really famous among traditionalist Catholics, but that, most people don't seem to know outside of those circles, and whose, early activism and then later sort of symbolic importance led to the rise of the other group that Matthew mentioned, which is Tradition, Family, and Property, who, if you're not familiar with them, I guess I'll just say, they're in a way, they're totally fabulous, right? They like have this like incredible penchant for pageantry, and they love to like run around in like fake crusader outfits with banners and, all kinds of iconography, right? There's something sort of like, amazing about their spectacularization of their traditional Catholicism. But certainly like how we got to them was one question within Catholicism. And then how we got to sort of the Brazilian variant of right-wing televangelism and of sort of right-wing megachurches in Protestant communities. And there I did find some kind of smoking guns, right? Some, direct communications between, leaders of these very different faith traditions, and a recognition that it was in their interests to work together over several decades. To sort of touch on something that Matthew said, I also think that, between, say, Brazil and El Salvador or Brazil and Mexico, right, there isn't necessarily a smoking gun in terms of contact. As Matthew pointed out, right, he's sort of, I think when we read each other's work, we can often sort of like recognize these similar patterns. And I think that the fact that there isn't necessarily, for example, a deep connection between ultra-traditionalist Catholics in Central America in the 80s and ultra-traditionalist Catholics in Brazil in the 60s is really revealing of the transnational nature of this story, right? I also have never found, evidence that, for example, like ultra-traditionalist Catholics in Brazil like went to Central America to foment a similar movement there. But I would say that by the 80s, they didn't really need to communicate directly, right? I mean, what is interesting is that part of what I saw in the archives was a really well-developed notion of shared struggles by this point, right? That is spread both by, technologies that have fallen by the wayside, but also by mass media that we're all pretty familiar with. So an example that I would offer is that in terms of this long arc of Catholics and Protestants coming together around these issues of traditionalism, is that group, Tradition, Family, and Property, they're quite busy running around in their crusader capes in Brazil, but they reach out across denominations and across national borders. And so in the 70s, they reach out to Protestant groups in the United States to say like, hey, you guys are fighting a culture war against, the issues that we recognize with gender and sexuality, morality, anti-communism, and a sort of promotion of incipient neoliberalism. We're doing the same thing, like maybe we should cooperate. And what I find most interesting about those overtures is not just that they happened, right? Not just that you have these traditionalist Catholics reaching out to ultra-right Protestants in another country, right? But also that nothing necessarily comes of each of those overtures because it doesn't have to, right? Each of these groups already sort of like knows where they stand. They know that they're on the same page, and they've already sort of shared the tactics that are necessary to propagate their movements and allow for further political cooperation. For example, like, Protestant preachers telling their flock to vote for a conservative Catholic candidate. So by the time that, Romero and his counterparts are sort of, adhering or not adhering to land reform in military El Salvador in 1979 and 1980, the right has already cohered in these transnational ways where they don't have to say like, import some sort of like, activist mentor from another place, because the sense of a transnational right-wing struggle that incorporates this sort of platform of anti-ecumenism, anti-communism, anti-secularization, anti-welfare state, and like fundamental support for traditionalism in the face of egalitarianism, that is already sort of in the bedrock of both ideological and tactical approaches to contemporary politics and culture. And so I think that sort of that long-term arc, right? It's not just that it's fascinating to watch it come together across the early decades of the 20th century, it's that it offers us a window into sort of how we get the configuration of extreme traditionalist Catholicism and Protestantism working together against the ideas represented or thought to be represented by Catholic social teaching, and that lead to the kind of violence that Matthew is talking about, right? The violence against Romero and this sort of like truly identitarian sense of a faith identity that incorporates cultural and political positions being so threatened that violence, whether spectacular or literal or figurative, is necessary. And for me, at least, that's where Gemma's work is so helpful, right? Because it allows us to think about how the violence that was implicit in these kinds of languages across many, many decades could also turn quite literal, right? I mean, there's a latent violence in all of the language and imagery of everyone that I study, right? Everything is a batalla, right? Everything is about inimigos who have to be vencidos, right? It's like, you know, I'm thinking back to sort of a moment in which a certain extremely traditionalist Catholic ideologue is talking about a Protestant activist in Brazil, and he calls this attempt to fight doctrinal modernism and sort of liberation theology, if you want to call it that. He calls it a sword thrust against the enemies of Our Lady, right? And thus sort of taking, you know, this classic imagery of the Crusades, classic imagery of religious violence, and sort of making it a part of a transnational and transdenominational anti-ecumenism and anti-communism that is violent in its imagery and very quickly thereafter turns violent in real life. And so, yeah, I think that might be, it was a little bit of a long-winded way of telling the whole story, but I just think it's part of this, of a long arc that leads to the moments that Matthew is talking about, which is, it's just so helpful for me to be in conversation with him for that reason.
This is awesome. Maybe we got to ask Hema a follow-up question on the contemporary. You're reading Hema Contemporary Mexico, and maybe it's time now to ask Matthew and Ben to follow up and to just, as Hema did, attempt to bring this to the present. So Matthew, there's a lot going on in El Salvador today, but how are various actors in contemporary El Salvador deploying notions of God, and how does this compare, if you will, to Romero's understanding of God as creator?
Thank you. And I by no means am an expert on sort of contemporary Latin America or contemporary Salvadoran politics. I read the news, but it's not my scholarly focus. I just want to say that at the outset. That's a great question. I mean, two things immediately come to mind, I guess. And one so one of the things that seems to me really significant and maybe isn't obvious about the language of creation and the doctrine of creation, at least as I understand it and use it in my own work, is that it's a really important point of contact between Christians and other religious believers and non-Christians, right? In terms of sort of political action, political motivation, mobilization, and, you know, collective action. And what I guess I mean by that is it's really interesting, for instance, that, you know, Romero's drawing on the Catholic social teaching tradition to talk about sort of land reform in terms of this belief about creation, but he's engaged with a lot of people who aren't Catholic Christians who are similarly concerned about issues of justice in relationship to land reform and wealth distribution, redistribution, but don't believe the same things that he does about God, but still sort of have a sense that there's something fundamentally unjust about the situation, right? And that's what I mean, that the doctrine of creation gives you, for those that believe in it, really sort of generative points of contact with people who don't profess the things you profess. And I think one way we see this, especially in the present, both in El Salvador and all over Latin America, really, is in the rise of land and environmental defenders. So one of the things that's interesting to me about these folks who, in the name of creation, Mother Earth, and other kinds of beliefs, they're very concerned about sort of extractivism, right? And the ways that sort of forests are being sort of, raised and logged, and rivers are being polluted, and their territories are being violated, right? Across sort of communities of different, races and, nationalities. They similarly have a sense that sort of, I would argue something like what Romero thinks when he's saying that creation is a common gift. I mean, Romero, the ecological implications of that, he doesn't make explicit. He was living in the 70s, but I think that it's the same sort of logic and sense of creation being something that's not meant for sort of my use alone, not meant for me to sort of hoard it and for other people not to have access to it, right? It's that same sort of fundamental set of beliefs, I think, that you oftentimes see cropping up in folks, land and environmental defenders across Latin America. There's especially prominent examples of sort of anti-mining in El Salvador. And if you're interested in this, the group Global Witness since 2012 has been sort of tracking this all throughout Latin America. And there have been thousands of people that have died as a consequence of this. And if you read their thought, if you watch them, listen to them, they'll oftentimes say things very much like what I've just been suggesting. The other thing that immediately comes to mind, I'll try to be as brief as possible, is obviously the situation, with the gangs and the state of exception, and state of emergency and of the Bukele administration. And Romero is very concerned about violence. I mean, I argue in the book that there's a kind of distinctive conception of violence that comes from this belief about creation. That's why Romero will say things like to the oligarchs of El Salvador, you possess the land that belongs to all Salvadorans. He basically calls them thieves. And he means that not in like a legal sense, but like in a moral sense. They are acting like thieves because they're violating this kind of commonality of creation. And I think like in the debates about what's happening with violence in El Salvador, and especially, in the legitimate desire for peace. I mean, many Salvadorans I know are very happy actually with the newfound sense of security that they have in terms of walking the streets. But someone like Romero and many others that are sort of working in the same sort of tradition of thinking, they're making arguments like, but we need to go to the roots of what's going on. Is sort of detaining people, not only gang members, but others, does this get at the fundamental roots of the violence? What is it that produces the gangs in the first place? what are the underlying injustices that have led to this situation? And are we dealing with this violence at a too superficial of a level? That is a very, very, very Romerian way of thinking. And you see many people making these kinds of arguments in El Salvador today.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah. David, should I ask Ben the follow-up, or yeah, just go ahead. Ben, so in a sense, your new book, Moral Majorities, historicizes Bolsonaro and Trump. Could you compare these two figures and the political movements that support them?
I believe I can. The question is, do we want to anymore? I think I'm certainly not the first person to make that comparison. And in a way, I found myself sort of like finishing the research as popular comparisons really exploded, and in a way that was, scary and, unpleasant, but also helpful to me in terms of thinking just where the story had gone. And, in many ways, the Trump and Bolsonaro could be seen as a kind of apotheosis of the construction of a kind of right-wing religious platform that I've been talking about, which always, in a sense, you could think about it as more affective than anything else, right? It's the creation of a series of identities that fuse, various kinds of sensibilities and then become sort of weaponized in the form of a Bolsonaro or a Trump, right? And so that kind of platform that I mentioned before, right, of anti-communism, opposition to secularization, opposition to expanding government and to the welfare state, opposition to ecumenism, and then, of course, the self-perception of traditionalists and of traditional hierarchies as victims, right? As the victims of an ongoing sort of conspiracy to spread egalitarianism and liberal democracies. Those, I think, it's a very familiar platform to many of us. And one thing that I had found in my research is just that at the heart of many of those complaints, and in a sense, what bound them together in an identitarian fashion, both for Catholics and for Protestants, wasn't just, the sort of the faith itself, right? It was the notion that a quotidian sense of the divine or the supernatural, right, which was conceived of as the source of the world's rightful moral and social hierarchies, that quotidian sense of the divine or quotidian relationship with the supernatural had been lost or abandoned, and that it would leave chaos in its wake. And I think that in the contemporary movements that have supported Trump and Bolsonaro and the like, we can really see that sense of loss or fear of such a loss really palpably, not just insofar as, a lot of right-wing movements that have supported both Bolsonaro and Trump and who, support movements like them in other places, not just that, it's obvious that they're afraid, right? That a sense of threat to the traditions or the cultures that they prize or think that they prize is really obvious or palpable. The notion of a mythic past is never far from the very language of these movements, right? Make America Great Again almost couldn't be more explicit in the sense of a sort of restorationist cause, right? The analog in Brazil would be the Bolsonaro slogan, which is "Quero meu país de volta," right? I want my country back, right? Which of course has been translated into many different languages, right? So in a sense, these guys are responding precisely to that anxiety, right? That there's something that has been lost that needs to be restored. And Trump and Bolsonaro, I think, show us the ways that is at its most basic level about putting a sense of the supernatural or of magic or of a kind of inarticulable logic of existence back into the world, right? A way in which conservatives can feel entitled to not have to sort of defend their positions logically, but just defend them emotionally, right? And say, well, these are unquestionable truths, right? The idea that, that, for example, gender is immutable, or that traditional sexual morality is the way that it has always been, to use the sort of current opposition to, various modalities of gender and sexual unconventionality, right? I mean, that would be one modality of that, or one way in which that is really obvious in the current political landscape. Another would be to use Matthew's, really insightful example, the treatment of crime and of criminals, right? I mean, if we think about, the option for a more socially or social justice oriented faith, particularly Catholic faith, to think about gang members or to think about those who have committed violence or who have transgressed as redeemable and lovable and, subject to the same mercy and to the same, capacity for forgiveness and change as everyone else, right? We humanize them through faith, but a kind of faith that requires growth and expansion and inclusion. Whereas if we iconize a kind of past in which there was just good and bad and things could be seen in a more Manichaean sense, then we get to the place that Matthew's talking about in Central America, or to, Trump talking about bad hombres, right? Or to Bolsonaro talking about a sort of faceless enemy who is only known in Brazilian political discourse as a bandido, right? Bandido. Like these are dehumanizations that depend on a sort of re-enchantment of the world, right? To use a Durkheimian way of thinking about it, right? A re-enchantment of the world that makes it easier to just live with injustice based on a faith that is representative of a traditional and divinely sanctioned hierarchy. And so I think the story that I saw in the archival documents that I was looking at really feels like it couldn't have led anywhere else other than Trump and Bolsonaro, given everything that has happened, right? That the possibilities that were foreclosed upon are precisely the possibilities of a more social justice oriented faith that was more empowered, right? That faith identity in both Brazil and the United States, it's not that it's not there or that it doesn't exist, it's just that it has been disempowered in these really important ways and doesn't appeal in the same way as a sort of Trumpism or Bolsonarism that's saying you can use your faith to be exclusive and to sort of batten down the hatches and retain what you think is rightfully yours.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, this just on Thursday, we looked at your chapter in which the progressive Protestants sort of you trace how they lose.
Yeah.
And but there was a possibility of a kind of Christianity that could have come to pass in Brazil. Our students are super bright and probably at this point ready to jump into the conversation. So for those of you in Costa Rica or somewhere else in Latin America, or for those of you in Toronto, now is the time for you guys to jump in. I think the chat is enabled, but I'm not positive. Good, Dennis from Costa Rica. Could we get 3 hands up first, and let's just take 3 questions. Let's, rather than just one, could we get 2 other people put your hands up? I mean that in the nicest way. Can we get two other people to jump into the conversation? We'll just all wait. Okay, I think you're a little nervous. Daniel,
There you go.
Juan Antonio. Okay, great. Let's take that in this order. I noticed that we have 3 men ready to jump into the conversation. Can we get some women into the mix as well? I know that. Really? Okay, well, you think about your questions, folks, and in the meantime, Dennis, and then Juan Antonio and Daniel. Dennis, go ahead, please.
Kevin.
Mucho gusto,
Ajá.
buenas tardes. Mi primera pregunta es para el profesor Matthew sobre Romero. ¿De qué influencia encontró él? En realidad son 2 preguntas. ¿Qué influencia encontró él de Rutilio Grande en la cuestión esta del padre Rutilio Grande, ¿verdad? O sea, ¿qué influencia encontró Monseñor Romero en la preocupación por la reforma agraria? Porque hasta la muerte de Rutilio Grande, Romero no tenía ninguna, se consideraba un obispo conservador para las élites y no tenía ninguna preocupación por la reforma agraria. Y la otra pregunta es, siempre con el profesor Matthew, sobre qué papel jugó pues la conferencia episcopal en el caso de Romero, porque en la zona de occidente del Salvador, en la zona de Santa Ana, donde estaban los cafetaleros, esta parte se volvió más conservadora y estaba en contra de la reforma agraria, ¿verdad? El caso, por ejemplo, de Monseñor Revelo, ¿verdad? Contreras, que era el obispo de Santa Ana y parte del Opus Dei, fue de los que más se opuso a la reforma agraria y de los que más tildó a Romero de comunista, ¿verdad? Por defender esta parte. Esas son mis preguntas. La otra pregunta es para la profesora Gema y es referente a qué papel jugaron las órdenes femeninas, ¿verdad? O qué significado se le dieron a las órdenes femeninas en el contexto de la violencia o en la guerra cristera, más bien dicho, ¿verdad? ¿Qué papel jugaron las órdenes femeninas, ¿verdad? Se me iba una pregunta, perdón, con el profesor Matthew, si la figura de San Francisco de Asís, que retoma la parte de defender la ecología, se retoma en el caso salvadoreño, por ejemplo, para el caso de este nuevo beato, el padre Cosme, ¿verdad? Que muere en los 80, que es un beato que también se inclinaba por la reforma agraria, ¿verdad? Tiene mucho que ver en esta parte ecológica, ¿verdad? Y para el profesor Cowan, mi pregunta es sobre esta construcción de la violencia, si él ha encontrado influencia, por ejemplo, de los protestantes, ¿verdad? O sea, más que todo, qué congregaciones, ¿verdad? O no sé cómo llamarla, si neopentecostales o pentecostales estuvieron del lado de Jair Bolsonaro, ¿verdad? Porque en el caso salvadoreño, pues se tiene esa idea, ¿verdad? De que los protestantes son de derecha, no todos, ¿verdad? Sino que algunos, ¿verdad? Pero los de tradición norteamericana, por ejemplo, los bautistas, los anabaptistas son de derecha, ¿verdad? Que tenemos acá el Tabernáculo Amigos de Israel, que es de Toby, ¿verdad? Tiene del hermano Toby Jr., ¿verdad? Que es parte de eso, Cashlun en el caso de Guatemala, que se cree, ¿verdad? La idea de que son aliados de la CIA, ¿verdad? Y todo ese rollo, ¿verdad? Entonces, en el caso de Brasil, ¿qué iglesias estuvieron más del lado de Bolsonaro y qué conflictos surgieron con las líneas más progresistas católicas, ¿verdad? Tengo entendido de que Usted hablaba de los heraldos del Evangelio, ¿verdad? Que son los que se creen cruzados, ¿verdad? Que en el caso costarricense está muy fuerte también, en el caso salvadoreño también, que es una cuestión muy aliada al Opus Dei, ¿verdad? Y si hubiera algún cierto conflicto o alianzas, más bien dicho, con estos grupos, ¿verdad? Porque para el caso salvadoreño también la iglesia anglicana, que estuvo del lado de Romero, pues pactó, ¿verdad? Y los luteranos también, o tenían las mismas ideas de reforma agraria y todavía, ¿verdad? Están más del lado de el progresismo católico, solamente. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Let's go to Juan Antonio.
Thank you, Professor Coleman. My question is for Professor Cobb Santamaria. I am curious about her opinion of the possibility of martyrdom in Mexico today, as things stand. Particularly, my question is if she thinks that the relationship between the church and the people in Mexico has changed drastically from the time she is writing about than today, and if she can comment on the recent facts about the Jesuit fathers that were killed and how that impacts or how that talks about this change or this radical change. Thank you.
I've only been using Zoom for 4 years. I still forget to unmute myself sometimes. Thank you, Juan Antonio. Daniel and Pablo, could you quickly put your questions out there? If you could be brief, and so we can give our panelists time to respond.
Claro, sí, mi pregunta está dirigida para el profesor Ben Cowan. Tiene que ver con en qué manera se relaciona, digamos, la teología de la prosperidad con este choque y esta reacción a los cambios en la liturgia que le preceden, ¿verdad? Hay una incorporación que se puede ver en la derecha, sin embargo, antes de esto hay una reacción a los cambios, y la teología de la prosperidad también es un cambio. Entonces, digamos, ¿por qué hay una reacción, digamos, de confrontación a ciertos cambios, pero la teología de la prosperidad sí puede ser como incorporada o compatible a las ideas de algunos católicos?
Okay, thank you. Pablo?
Ok, sí. Bueno, tengo una general que no sé a quién podrá responderla. Primero, ¿qué papel jugó, digamos, en el anticomunismo en la relación que tuvo el Estado y la Iglesia? Sobre todo antes y después de la Guerra Fría, porque muchos digamos, del discurso anticomunista se ha revivido, sobre todo con Bolsonaro y no sé hasta qué punto Trump. Y luego, no sé si fue Matthew o Ben, que mencionó que no había como una relación formal sí, formal entre estos grupos neopentecostales. Sin embargo, bueno, tengo familiares que son protestantes, y si hay como misiones religiosas, sobre todo de grupos religiosos en los Estados Unidos, que visitan Centroamérica y que de alguna forma difunden, digamos, estas ideas, esta nueva forma de protestantismo liberal. Entonces, hasta cierto punto me hizo pensar que quizás hay una red ahí, digamos, ideológica que quizás algunos actores, bueno, hacen circular por medio, digamos, de grupos religiosos o iglesias. O sea, no sé, se me vino esta idea y no sé si habrá alguna respuesta a esto.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Pablo. Ben, Hema, Matthew, I think if it's okay, Ben and Matthew, could we ask Hema to start? I think it's been a while since we've had a chance. Hema, would you mind?
No, of course. I mean, and thank you for these fantastic questions. I mean, I'm learning from the students clearly, like this is an amazing course and you are so lucky to have these brilliant students engaging with, I mean, I feel very privileged that they've been reading our work. And I also have taken many notes of what, Matthew and Ben said. I mean, and I just want to kind of confirm that it just confirms my, like I'm always benefiting so much from, cross-disciplinary, but also like comparative analysis. And I've, thought about many connections like that I hadn't thought before, just from listening and learning more about your work. So thank you. So I would start with a question about the órdenes femeninas. And it's very, I mean, it's really interesting because I mean, there is not enough knowledge, there is not enough scholarship about the participation of women in the Cristero War. I think it has been, like marginalized, and the reason for that is that we don't have enough sources to understand what was their participation of the órdenes femeninas, but also of like lay women. And just to give you an example, I was in the Vatican archives last summer, and I was struck by the fact that there was like this tiny folder on the Brigadas Juana de Arco, which was the, like the official arm of the Cristeros, integrated by women, and that they not only assisted in bringing weapons, but also like had very like clear leadership roles. And it was just like this thin folder, no? I mean, and if you go to UNAM, where they also have like collections of Cristero, all the documents that they have are very technical, but you don't get a sense of what was the actual participation of these women. And I think these are the types of silences in the archive that tell you a lot about the type of censorship and how the activism of women, both in civil and uncivil forms of organization, was really not welcome, neither by the clergy nor by the leadership. No, I mean, so I have, because the type of violence that I study is this type of like, like low level, quote unquote, disorganized, spontaneous violence. I've been able to trace the really like important role of women in organizing lynchings and riots, no? And it's very clear that they have like a very, very important role. And colleagues of mine, like Edward Wright Rios, like have documented how in the 1920s and 1930s, the role of women was fundamental in order to revitalize the presence of the Catholic Church. No, I mean, in the midst of the Cristero War and the demobilization of the Cristeros, like women play a fundamental role. And actually Matthew's colleague, Ricardo Álvarez Pimentel, who is a great colleague of mine, he has worked on Acción Católica Femenina, Acción Católica de Mujeres in Mexico, and also trace how their role was so crucial. So I think it hasn't been studied enough, not in terms of like the official participation of these women, but once you look at the archive and once you look at these quote unquote disorganized forms of violence that I've studied, you see that their role is central. And I guess the last thing I would say is that, again, from a gender perspective, as I said before, like this notion of like martyrdom that fuses with the figure of the hero, it's totally informed by masculinity constructs and by virility. So in that regards, of course, again, women are not welcome into this activism, no? I mean, be it civil or uncivil. And then I wanted to move to the question of martyrdom today, and I think this is quite crucial, and I wanted to answer in two ways. Like, one is that there is a very clear tradition, like and kind of like, I mean, again, memory, history are never linear, but you see the activism of Jesuits today, and you see, of course, organizations such as the Miguel Pro for Human Rights in Mexico today, and they are totally inspired by the more, I would say like the more social kind of like human rights, although, like Miguel Pro wasn't necessarily embracing, what we would consider after more progressive ideas, but in terms of the legacy of human rights and the legacy of defending, people's critical engagement with social justice, and also like speaking truth to power, not to what the state does. There is a very clear, genealogy in terms of like Jesuit forms of activism in human rights in Mexico. And as I said before, like the I mean, especially like Jesuit priests have been central in promoting peace building initiatives in Mexico. And in that process, they have upset both drug trafficking organizations and also, unfortunately, government officials that either benefit from the drug business or support this militarization and punitive approach to the war on drugs. And the other thing I would say is not necessarily related to martyrdom, but just a very crucial thing that is so interesting to me is that if you trace the map of Cristero uprisings and where Cristeros took hold, I mean, there's a very similar map of self-defense forces today. So like the kind of like map of vigilantism and armed vigilantes and self-defense forces is part of this like long-term tradition, and it's not necessarily like the same like political stance as the ones that defend the memory of PRO, but it's more like this long tradition of, like distrust in the state's intervention, and goes in the direction of like taking matters into their own hands. No, so again, it's never like very linear. No, it's very complex. And then I think the only thing I wanted to say about, because I don't want to take too much time, and I already did, but the only thing I wanted to say about the anti-communism, because the Mexican case is really fascinating. No, I mean, you have first, like a socialist government that clearly upsets Catholics that are much more conservative, but then the Mexican government itself in the 1940s becomes this, anti-communist, nationalist, conservative government. And so there's an alignment, a very strong alignment between Catholicism and the Mexican state in the 1940s and 1950s. And this is what renders, in that moment of like pre-Cold War, Protestants vulnerable. So you have anti-Protestant campaigns happening in 1940s, 1950s Mexico, taking place also in Brazil and also in Colombia at the same time, with this impetus of like anti-communism that takes place in mid-20th century Latin America. And that is something that I'm studying right now. So I'm very, like interested again in drawing connections that I really appreciated how Ben put it. No, I mean, they are not necessarily like the smoking gun, but you see how in terms of ideas, they are entirely connected, and they are of course also connected to the United States and to the Vatican.
Thank you, Hema. That's great. Maybe that's a transition to Ben.
Sure. Yeah. Again, thank you, Gemma, for those, incredible comments, so generative. And, muchísimas gracias a todos por las preguntas incisivas y generosas y generativas. Voy a hacer mis comentarios en inglés para no deslizar para el terreno del portuñol o para el portugués en sí. I think, there's so much to say in response to each of those questions, but I guess I'll start with Daniel and your question about the teología de la prosperidad, right? And how it is un cambio, right? But it's approved by the right and sort of incorporate of a sort of transnationally established and approved and sort of presumed slate of political and faith-based issues is able to sort of subsume and resolve contradictions, right? I think that I see this as one of the sort of central planks of this story, right? One of the sort of central avenues of how we get to where we are. Which also relates to Dennis's questions about different denominations, right? And how certain ones are on the side of conservatism and certain are on the side of progressivism, or, progresismo, to use a better word, right? And so, in specific response to Dennis's question, yeah, neo-Pentecostales and Pentecostales and Batistas are, always the prime suspects, it seems, when it comes to, those Protestants who have not taken advantage of, but availed themselves of political circumstances to become, the most rapidly growing, as well as the most conservative and the most sort of like contemporarily anti-communist denominations. So also in the other countries under study here, certainly in Brazil and in the United States, you know, it's the traditional or the mainline, as we call them in English, denominations, right? As you pointed out, right, the Lutherans and the Anglicans, as well as, you know, even Methodists, right? Those historic denominations, as they're called in Brazil, right? Denominações históricas, right? The mainline traditions are the ones that have tended to be much more open to progressive ideas within Christianity. And it is definitely the Neopentecostales and Pentecostales and Batistas who tend to go in the other direction. And that goes right up until the theology of prosperity, right? It's certainly Pentecostals and Neo-Pentecostals and Baptists who have been most likely to engage in the theology of prosperity, which they don't necessarily paint as a change, right? In a certain sense, that is precisely the innovation of the right-wing religiosity that we're seeing. It's that, you know, they are taking what would be a contradiction and presenting it as a return to a particular kind of tradition, right? Other examples of that sort of that turn would be you know, a change from opposing ecumenism, right, to sort of joining hands with other faith denominations in order to oppose ecumenism, right? I ended up in my own work and in my own brain calling that anti-ecumenist ecumenism, right? Because of course, you know, it is a deep contradiction, right? How can you oppose ecumenism and yet do so by like cooperating with people from other denominations, right? You know, on the face of it, it seems totally nonsensical, right? And yet it is the necessary step to take, right? It is the only way that you can sort of move forward in the face of these anxieties about changes in the way that different faiths or different denominations might relate to each other is by relating to other people who share those anxieties, right? Another example, I think, would be the very entry of evangelicals into politics, right? I mean, Catholics have a different relationship with this, but when I look around today, right, and at the sort of the ways that religious conservatism manifests, or even conservatism in general manifests, you know, maybe some of the rest of you have noticed this, right? But we see like images of conservative religious devotion in political spaces represented to us all the time now, right? In a sense, you can almost like look on social media or on mass media and see people sort of praying, right? Having moments of devotion with regard to Trump, or especially with regard to Bolsonaro, right? I mean, many of the images coming out of Brazil in the aftermath of Lula's election last spring in Brazil, but last fall in the Northern Hemisphere, you know, show people literally prostrating themselves, right? Their protest is, you know, having a transcendent faith experience in public, right? Praying, not just praying, but like, you know, being possessed by the spirit in their desire for a particular political outcome, which of course is contradictory in the same way that the theology of prosperity is contradictory, in that, you know, doctrinal traditionalism would say, you know, a Deus as coisas de Deus y a César as coisas de César, right? A Dios las cosas de Dios y a César las cosas de César, right? That's that was a fundament of doctrinal traditionalism forever, but it has totally disappeared, right? Because it is no longer expedient, and because it can't allow for the sort of continued impact and continued growth of a religious conservative identity. And so I think for me, right, we have to sort of think of faith within each of these denominations as a kind of clearinghouse, right, that allows people to resolve the contradictions which are the manifestation of some unresolvable anxieties, right? There's no way of encountering the complexity of human experience and human expression, you know, if you'll allow me to pontificate myself, you know, without some trouble and some challenges and some discomfort. It takes a lot of work to include people, and it takes sacrifice, right? Which is precisely what liberation theology is demanding of people, which is in another sense precisely what people are reaching out to when they either incorporate or reinvent notions of martirio, right? To reach out to what Gemma has so helpfully pointed to us to. So you know, the contradictions themselves, I think, are really telling, right? Because they show us the way in which like subsuming contradiction allows people to deal with these anxieties that are in themselves like what has led to this moment in terms of the religious right. And I think that to get to Pablo's question, right, that is nowhere more true than in the sort of the readoption, right, of anti-communism as a fundamental plank of the relationship between you know, the state and the church, or at least the state and the faith. And at least for me, that's one way in which, you know, Latin America has kind of led the way, right? You know, there was a time when articulated anti-communism kind of fell out of political discourse in the United States because, I mean, in part because the idea was that the Cold War had been won and the United States and its allies were the victors, right? But all of that time, you had people in Latin America talking about marxismo cultural, right? And, you know, in sort of using the language of a faith-based, Christian-based Marxism to sort of portray contemporary conservative identities as rooted in a faith of the past, right? Like, oh, you know, we're fighting marxismo cultural right now, but that's the same as, you know, older faith traditions fighting, you know, marxismo itself, right? So in a sense, you can't get to where we are today without an Olavo de Carvalho in Brazil sort of paving the way philosophically by just using a new narrative to paper over those very contradictions. And I think, you know, that I love those questions, right? Because they show us, right, that like by sort of zeroing in on those things and challenging them, we find the sort of place of how potent these formulations of right-wing religious identity are.
Thank you, Ben. Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I will try to be brief. I guess Dennis asked some really great questions about Romero and his relationship to Rutilio Grande. I mean, one of the things that Dennis, I'd love to, me encantaría hablar más con usted sobre el tema. Sorry, I'll just speak in English. So the question of the relationship of Rutilio Grande to Oscar Romero is probably, if you read anything about or hear anything about Oscar Romero, this is something that consistently comes up. And there's sort of what I call a dominant story, which is that Romero was sort of a conservative reactionary, and then Rutilio Grande dies, and then all of a sudden scales fall from Romero's eyes, and he becomes a progressive, liberationist, et cetera. My view is it's just really much more complicated than that. For instance, in my archival research, I found abundant documentation from the early 70s that Romero actually was deeply involved in debates about land reform within El Salvador. At that time, those debates weren't as sort of conflictive as they became later. But he was very much involved in them at that time as an auxiliary bishop in San Salvador, and that's 6 years before Rutilio Grande died, right? So that's not to say that there aren't changes in Romero. It is to say that those changes are not just sort of his changing beliefs, they're also the changing external circumstances as the situation grew increasingly violent, the sort of resistance to sort of the government grew increasingly radicalized, right? So there's a lot of things that were going on, but certainly with Rutilio's death, you know, there were also sort of a sense in Romero's part that that the church was facing a new level of persecution. But with regard to Romero's activism for and advocacy for land reform, it, you know, long precedes Rutilio's death. In 1977. In terms of the bishops' conference, I mean, something that's just really worth noting is that 1969, after the soccer war, the short-lived war between El Salvador and Honduras, in which many Salvadorans over the preceding decades had migrated to Honduras and were then kicked out of Honduras, and that was one of the major precipitating events of the soccer war. The bishops' conference came together in 1969 and was advocating for something like land reform. So the bishops' conference at one point was sort of speaking in a single voice. Later, it became much more fractious. And that is, I think, a consequence of the fact that, the labor organizing, the sort of rural organization, the countryside, that all those sort of organizations that were at one point advocating for reform, land reform and otherwise, they began to advocate more explicitly for revolution. They were taking up arms. And so that situation is also changing. That is part of behind what Ravello's judgments in that regard. So anyway, it's very complex, but I think that the story of Romero in this regard is really quite fascinating, actually, and quite different from, I think, the dominant stories that we oftentimes hear.
Thank you to all three of you and to our students. David, would you, I can say a few things to close, but I think it might be best for you to jump in at this point.
Sí, ha sido una actividad fascinante. Estamos muy contentos con esta mesa redonda que creo que ha sido muy provechosa para nuestros estudiantes en común, pero también para Kevin y para mí, que estamos muy interesados en seguir con esta temática. Muchas gracias de verdad a Gemma, muchas gracias a Matthew, muchas gracias Ben, obrigado. Estamos muy satisfechos por estas casi 2 horas de conversación. Creo que ha sido un viaje extraordinario por el pasado, pero también por el presente. Y queda muy en claro, primero, que Matthew no solo es teólogo, también es analista social. Y segundo, queda muy claro que el pasado nunca está muerto. El pasado vive en la cotidianidad. Y en estos tiempos, además, estos tiempos en que vemos el ascenso de personajes como Trump o Bolsonaro, se vuelve más importante todavía volver a estudiar el pasado en vista de el tremendo impacto que estas figuras pueden tener en nuestras sociedades. Quedo muy satisfecho, muy agradecido con los tres y esperando volver a vernos en otra oportunidad.
Yeah. No, thank you, David. I agree completely. Thanks to Hema, Ben, and Matthew for you guys engaged with each other in an organic way. It's beautiful. This movement between Brazil, Mexico, and Central America, between theology and history and sociology, between past and present. Very, very generous. We appreciate this. Thank you to all three of you and to our students.